Personal finance.
24 minutes now to 8 the time. So you may well remember the moment when your eyes met across a bar or a braai or somewhere, and you started talking to this person, and maybe within the first hour, maybe only within the first year, you realized you were going to spend the rest of your life with this person. I don't know if you thought at the time, I mean, I'm not going to say to you what you were thinking at the time. I know what I was thinking at the time. I don't know how much thinking I was doing, but I remember the time very well. But what I probably didn't realize, and what maybe you didn't realize, and maybe what you won't realize when it happens to you, and I hope it does, is how important your life partner is to your finances and how much that's really going to matter. I mean, probably the biggest single factor, actually. And whether you succeed is probably going to be based on, your relationship with them. And if you fail, that too, I'm afraid to say. Well, not something we talk about often in personal finance, but money in relationships. John Manyike is the head of financial education at Old Mutual, a braver man than I, willing to talk about relationships and money in public. John, good evening. Thanks so much for coming in.
Good evening to you, and thanks for having me.
So you meet, you talk, and probably the first financial conversation you have is roughly at maybe the end or maybe just the beginning of your first date. Because someone says, okay, the waiter arrives with the bill, and your first financial conversation is probably in the seconds after that.
No, absolutely. And I like how you put it there, because very often we take it that it's not a financial decision when you go on a first date and the bill comes. I think there's an assumption that the one who asked the other for a date must actually settle the bill. And we know in most cases, I mean, men are expected to be the ones that pay the bill, because I would imagine you are the one who asked the lady out. I
honestly can't remember anymore.
Yeah. So it is a financial decision, because, I mean, I've heard some weird stories where apparently somebody would ask somebody out on a date, and then when the bill comes, then somebody starts biting their teeth, and or to make matters worse, maybe you ordered more than you have in your bank account, and then you start calling friends and things like that. But when it comes to major financial issues, people tend not to talk about these things during the dating phase. In fact, I think the dating phase is probably one of the most dangerous phases in any relationship. I mean,
financially, you mean?
Yeah, financially speaking, because I believe that one of the most financial decisions we ever have to make in our lives is who we marry, how we marry, what type of marriage regime we're going to enter into. But more often than not, we don't discuss finances during the dating phase. In fact, that's what I call the marketing phase. I mean, it's like a political party campaigning for elections. And you come up with this manifesto, you create an impression that you can give a person a better life, that you can offer them security and all sorts of things. But more often, you find that even the type of places you take your partner to, you actually stretch yourself, but you're raising the bar and creating this expectation that, well, this is the kind of life I'm going to live. But picture it. I mean, how many people stop going out once they had the baby? The things they used to do during the dating phase are not happening. So there's unfulfilled expectations, unmet expectations, because we've created these expectations.
Okay, so what you're suggesting then is that, and I think we all kind of know this, that when you go out in your dating phase, it's very different to, I want to call it real life. You can still recreate that phase, of course, and you do. Often, and sometimes not even dating, you still recreate it. But the expectation and the financial expectation is crucially important. I mean, and that goes to kind of what car you arrive in, things like that too. And nowadays, is it an Uber Go or an Uber Black,
Yeah. So I think you're here. This is why I would say to people, during the dating phase, you need to make sure that the marketing budget does not exceed the operational budget. Because you're going to create the impression that you go to high places, you go weekend away, or even travel abroad. But can you sustain that kind of lifestyle that you are creating? And then, of course, there's the other side where you almost have to be, actually, you have to be comfortable with the financial habits of your partner. If you know that your partner is a big spender and you want to marry that one, you have to understand that that's what you have to put up with should you decide to marry that one. So you can't ignore that. I mean, I know the common phrase that's used on social media is red flags. Don't ignore the red flags. But there are indeed red flags, because a lot of marriages are broken because suddenly you realize this is not what I thought it would be. Or at times there are frustrations where you're married and suddenly you realize that you're the one who is doing most of the heavy lifting. Yeah, you're doing heavy duty, and you expected your partner to be doing the heavy duty. But the thing is that, did you even discuss it in the first place? So I think we have to have that open conversations up front.
How do you even start that conversation, John? I mean, what do you say? So I've been thinking a bit about money and we should discuss it. Maybe what's better is if you make an appointment to discuss it. So then you kind of know what the appointment is for.
No, and I think the timing, you're right. The timing has to be perfect, because can you imagine bringing up the financial matter when you've just had a disagreement on something else? So the timing has to be perfect, and you have to be very mature about it. But this is a very necessary conversation to have before you take the next step, because earlier on we spoke about the financial habits. But there are other things. For example, you want to understand, let's say you're discussing next steps, you deciding that you're going to marry. I think that's the best time where you need to start having this conversation. As soon as your partner starts talking about taking your relationship to the next level, as in marriage, then you need to interrogate the person to say, well, if you want us to get married, there are a couple of things that we need to consider. I think that's the best time to be talking about finances if you are taking your relationship to the next level. I'm happy to sponsor a couple of questions and that one could pose to their partner when they get to that point.
I mean, part of it is also you decide to move in together, right? At some point, you need to have a conversation about who pays the bills, or who pays which bill, or how do you do that, or who pays the rent. And I mean, so often in a divorce, the man's been paying the bond because he's been earning more. He then claims the house is his, but the woman has been paying all the food bills, for example. Yeah. And that leads to a huge fight. Correctly so?
No, absolutely. And lawyers will tell you that as soon as you start living together, sharing financial responsibilities, that's potentially a universal partnership. And there's a particular way that courts would deal with that, because then you're starting to mix your finances. I mean, the assets that you're acquiring there's financial and non-financial contributions which take place when you start cohabiting. And sometimes, one of the reasons conversations about money doesn't happen, because even the cohabiting, how it starts, it's often sometimes it's discussed in some relationships.
Sometimes it's a bit informal.
Yeah, it's informal because it starts with a person visiting and then they leave their slippers. The next time they leave something else, and then before you know it, when you check, half of the wardrobe has got their clothes on there. So I think we need to be having that conversation even about finances. But I think the issue of cohabiting, we also have to consider the financial risks of cohabiting, because it's like mixing salt and sugar and then later on being asked to separate it. So yes, the one is paying the bond, you paying water and lights, somebody else is buying groceries and so on. So those are financial contributions. And so how do you deal with the assets that you've acquired over a couple of years living together like that? Because somebody might feel that, but I've been paying water and lights and buying groceries, and these are things we've consumed, but you still have a house. So when in such cases, when couples approach the court may likely look at the potentially a universal partnership of some sort, and they can make some determination in terms of how the assets to some extent have to be divided between it may not necessarily be 50-50, but I mean, obviously the merits of the case would have to be considered. But one needs to be very careful when you get into that kind of relationship. It doesn't mean that just because it doesn't have the marriage status, that there are no financial implications.
I mean, the trick is to also talk about it. Yes, you might have moved in informally. Yes, this might be, the 17th weekend in a row that he's here. But you need to talk about it.
No, absolutely. You need to do so, especially because I think people take for granted that when you decide to marry, especially in community of property, you never even looked at what the person's financial situation was in terms of their debts. So if you have a partner that comes into the relationship with a 5 million debt, and you don't interrogate that, and you then say, I do, and then effectively it means you've just become an instant shareholder of a 5 million debt.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. There's a lot to look at there. In a moment, the next step in your financial conversation. What happens when you get married? What's the best way to do it? Should you share a bank account or not? John Manyike is the head of financial education at Old Mutual. Your calls for him too on 011 883 0702 and 0214460567. Your questions for John Manyike this evening. 12 minutes to 8.
The Money Show. Personal finance.
John Manyike is the head of financial education at Old Mutual with you tonight, talking about the finance of relationships. John, you mentioned, okay, so now we've done the dating, the cohabitation. One does seem to follow the other almost automatically nowadays. Then you've got the marriage, right? And I mean, I remember a friend of mine just saying to me, Stephen, whatever you do, don't get married in community of property. I said, why? He said, because every time you sign a contract, you both have to sign it. There are lots of different ways to do it, of course.
No, absolutely. I mean, I guess different strokes for different folks. I mean, I often get a question, which one is the best one? And I'd say, look, it depends on the couple. It depends on what works for you. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach there. I mean, you have to look at your age as well. Counts. I mean, do you have any assets? Is one of you in business? Because if you're dating a tenderpreneur, and they're gonna need a lot of capital, which in order to execute the tender, there's all sorts of risk. I know of people who said, no, let's change our marriage contract because of the risk, because of the kind of business that these are things that people need to discuss upfront to say what kind of a marriage contract we want to enter into, and speak to a lawyer, speak to a financial advisor. But marriage contracts are part of a estate planning tool, if you like, because you have to be clear what will work for you.
Sometimes, occasionally, I'll be with other couples and talking about this and talking about that. And it seems to me that there's a million different ways of managing your money together. So this couple will each have their own account. One will pay the bond, one will pay the school fees, one will do this, one will do that. This group will each have their own accounts and a joint account. It's difficult to have a joint account in South Africa, but they'll find a way. There are lots of ways to do it. These ones will have one account that they both share, and the money will go in and out of that one account, and then everyone kind of knows. It's very transparent, at least. Yeah. They all seem to have strength. I mean, is there any one obvious way that's the best way to do it? Or any one obvious, don't do this at all, it's a bad way? Because whenever this comes up, you have to really know people before you ask them, how do you manage your money between the two of you? You're talking about two things you should never discuss, your marriage and money. And yet there seems to be so many different ways to do it.
No, absolutely. Look, there are definitely so many different ways to do it. And I would say, look, I mean, you have to look at the personalities involved because we are different. I remember when you marry someone, you basically bringing two people together with completely different backgrounds, different sets of attitudes, sometimes different sets of values. And also, can a person be trusted? Is it somebody you can trust? I learned of a case of a couple a few years ago where the wife said to the husband, listen, we've been living in this townhouse for too long. I think it's about time we buy ourselves a standalone house. So the husband said it's okay. And then the wife started shopping around, and eventually um, um, she thought she found something, and she said, okay, let's sell a townhouse. They did. And after they sold the property, and then they said, okay, now we're going to buy that one. And they went to the bank. And guess what? When they did the credit checks, they found that their husband was in red, over 300,000, which the wife had no idea where it came from. So the question is that, can you trust your partner? Is it somebody reliable that you won't get surprises? And remember, here we're talking about human beings. I mean, we're not perfect. And that's why you find that at times you think you trust somebody, and they end up having other relationships outside the marriage. And sometimes you even discover that they've got children outside. I mean, there's a term that tends to be used. People say you have satellite branches. So the problem with the satellite branches there is that you don't realize that money is going somewhere else. So that's why I'm saying you have to be very, very careful, and be sure that you know your partner to decide what is the best. But my small piece of unsolicited advice would be, you need to be certain that you can trust your partner, and decide what works for you. I just think that you need to look at who's strong when it comes to handling finance, who's the most disciplined.
Yeah.
Whether it doesn't have to be the husband all the time. Even if it's a wife, if the wife is strong in managing finances, you have to allow her to do that, if you know. But there's no point in insisting, I'm the head of the family. But the thing is, if you're terrible with handling finances, let her do it. Or vice versa. So those are other things that I think couples need to look at.
I mean, I remember one couple years ago when credit cards were still relatively new and you didn't have cell phones, is, for one person was the big spender and the other one therefore had the credit card. And so that only the one could spend, whatever the other one wanted to buy. It had to be managed very carefully, and that kind of stuff works. There will be times, I think, when, you will see your partner's phone open because they're asleep or something, and you'll want to go and look at their banking app.
Yeah.
Should you do it?
I wouldn't advise that, because you might think you are trying to check the bank balance, but you may find things that you're not ready to handle.
Or don't understand the context of.
So yeah, absolutely. And you might be rushed into hospital with a stretcher. So I wouldn't advise that you do that. Rather have an open and honest conversation about money. But also, I don't think couples should restrict themselves to the extent where you can't even have your own 10 rand to buy yourself a snack or something like that. I mean, yes, as long as we've dealt with the major issues, expenses rather, be it your bond, cars, school fees, water and lights, and then still have your own pocket money for the month. But, because then life becomes boring, where everything is just mechanical.
Yes, no, I know what you mean. And sitting down and doing a budget together? I mean, I know you're going to recommend that.
Absolutely.
But it's very disciplined and can be very boring.
No, it can be very boring. But, I think it's important because it's all about boundaries, to be honest. Everything when it comes to finances, I would even argue that about many things in life, it's about boundaries. If you cross that boundary, you're going to have problems. For example, people spending more than they earn, it means you're crossing the boundary. Borrowing money beyond what you can afford to pay, you're crossing a boundary. So a lot of times we are in trouble financially because of not respecting these boundaries. And the budget helps you to stay within those boundaries.
Should you ever, as a couple, discuss your finances together with someone else?
Yes, with your financial advisor, do have that conversation, because you have to talk about, okay, what is for things like a life cover. You need to discuss what happens if one of us passes away. We need to make sure that we are able to sustain the family, the children and things like that. You need to talk about having a will. You don't necessarily have to divulge the detail, but those are things that you definitely need to talk about with your financial advisor.
John Manyike, it's been great to get some and some financial advice too. Thank you very much indeed. John Manyike is the Head of Financial Education at Old Mutual.